And of course, this sort of more clear-cut strategic directive at curtailing China becomes a lot more muddled when it comes to the various trade tiffs and tariff uncertainties that the US has going with a number of these countries. How complicated does this become, particularly at a time where there's also grabs about Trump wanting Indo-Pacific allies to be spending more on defence post the NATO meeting?
Yeah, it's a great question because the impetus for the Trump administration is to reaffirm the importance of the Quad. It's also the shared objective of all the other three countries that are going to be joining them too, to make sure that they can present as united a front as possible about what the Quad contributes to regional stability, to regional prosperity, to regional security. But of course, that cuts against the narrative of Washington imposing tariffs on these three countries and everyone else in the world. So that is clearly one of the issues that will be discussed about how to promote their cooperation, how to deepen collaboration, potentially in the defense realm, while at the same time mitigating some of the downside of the U.S. tariff actions that it's taken on these countries.
President Trump has a pretty unorthodox approach to diplomacy. We've seen Anthony Albanese turn up to the G7 only for Trump to leave before they could have their one-on-one. What are the stakes for Australia at this point, and how do you best, I guess, assess that relationship and the importance or lack of importance perhaps being attached?
No, I think the U.S.-Australian alliance is understood as very important on both sides of the ledger. The fact that Anthony Albanese has not yet met with President Trump, despite the fact that they've had a couple of phone calls, has now become something of a thing because it's been multiple months, multiple missed opportunities, but that in and of itself should not be taken nor understood as a understanding of where the bilateral relationship is. The United States sees Australia as a very trusted ally. That doesn't mean that there aren't friction points between the two. That's clearly going to come up in terms of the tariff imposition, in terms of the increasing U.S. pressure for Australia to spend more on its own defense, and for the ongoing AUKUS review. But given the background, the historical ties between the two, and the deep cooperation on almost all levels, this is a relationship that is too big to fail for both nations. So they really are going to get after these and discuss those points of friction.
How important is the critical minerals cooperation between these two countries, both on a security level and also at the trade level?
Yeah, increasingly so, Sherry. Critical minerals obviously are important, have been discussed between the two. But as China has weaponized its access to critical minerals, to rare earth minerals, this is something that potentially is an area of great growth of collaboration between the two. In fact, about a year and a half ago, Australia and the United States signed an agreement to expand their work together on clean energy, on climate change, and on critical minerals. Under the Trump administration, they're not going to be talking about climate change too much, but critical minerals is still clearly part of what they're going to be doing. And Anthony Albanese, in his re-election campaign, talked repeatedly about the importance of making sure that there was a trusted supply chain for the United States and other allies. So this is an issue that has been important, but is becoming increasingly so for both trade and national security purposes.
Charles, in the broader Pacific, we know that U.S. engagement with the region has revolved around development assistance. But given Washington's really retreat from that space, is that going to be a hurdle going forward?
Yes, that's about as blunt of an answer as we can say. The United States has, over the last several years, stepped up its engagement with the Pacific. This actually started under Trump's first presidency, where he invited the leader of the COFA nations, Palau, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, to the United States. It expanded under the Biden administration, but as you rightly note, the State Department has cut, or at least said that it's all of its development assistance is under review. At a time when China is increasing its footprint, when the United States has claimed that it's going to be opening more embassies, this is an issue of some concern about how the United States can work with the Pacific if it's seen as only episodically engaging. So that will be an issue of discussion between them about what they are doing and where this review at the State Department might land.
Should Australia be doing more, given that it is, when it comes to a lot of these Pacific nations and islands, in our own backyard, right? We know that even just in the latest op-ed from the Global Times, the accusation of Australia taking on the Monroe Doctrine mentality when it comes to opposing Chinese aid and investment in some of these economies is really being subject to pushback from Beijing.
Yeah, I think we all know that we won't take the words of the Global Times too seriously. But your question about whether or not Australia should do more, we should note that Australia is already the largest bilateral giver of aid and development assistance across the Pacific. The question is, should Australia do more if the United States is doing less? And there is clearly discussion of that in Canberra. I know that there was a review undertaken of what Australian equities would be affected if the United States stepped back. But Australia, like every other nation in the world, has a limited amount of resources, so it needs to think carefully about where it's going to put them.
I wanted to end with a question on AUKUS. There's obviously numerous reviews that have either ongoing or have already happened. Do you think Australia should be conducting a review? Do you think that AUKUS remains on stable footing going forward? Does it still make sense?
So let's take those questions in reverse order. Does it still make sense? Yes. The strategic objectives about getting more capabilities, particularly submarines, into the water to balance China's increasingly aggressive stance, absolutely still makes sense. In terms of should Australia undertake its own review, it has undertaken its own review. A non-public review was conducted and delivered to their government recently. This is in line with what the Brits have done as well. They also had a non-public review that was delivered to government. In fact, the Americans are the only one who have not conducted a strategic review of AUKUS. So the timing of a review makes eminent sense. AUKUS's goals and objectives still stand, I think, but that's not to say that they haven't had problems moving it forward. And to understand how they can move it forward is, I think, critical at this point. There's a larger question of whether or not the United States is wrapping up or maybe even holding AUKUS hostage to try to get Australia to increase its own defense spending. That's a separate issue that will be discussed with them, but the fact that there's a review of AUKUS shouldn't be a cause of concern.
Charles, really great to have you with us. Charles Edel, who's a Senior Advisor and Australia Chair at CSIS. We have more on Australia Ahead every Tuesday at 10:40 a.m. if you're watching in Sydney, 8:40 a.m. in Hong Kong.